Welcome to the Baker McKenzie Latin America EMI Talks podcast series focusing on sector-specific issues that are impactful to the players of the energy, mining, and infrastructure industry.
Hello, everyone. I'm Bruno Duarte from Trent Rossi Watanabe, Brazilian law firm in cooperation agreement with Baker McKenzie. I'm based in São Paulo, and I'm a member of the Latin America Energy, Mining, and Infrastructure Projects Group. I'd like to welcome you to our podcast, Financial Relief Measure in Latin America's Major Projects. And it is my pleasure to introduce our speakers today, Jose Pepe Barnola, tax partner from Mexico City, and Yoshie Concha, public law associate from our Lima office.
Thank you, Bruno. It is a pleasure sharing with you and Yoshie.
Thank you, Bruno, Pepe. I'm really glad to participate in this podcast.
Thank you both. Today's conversation, we are going to analyze the impact of the COVID-19 situation, starting with an overview of what we call a resilience stage, how major projects in Latin America have faced the pandemic effects due to the shutdown of operations or to the consumption downturn, and also how federal and state governments are reacting to provide financial relief measures to distressed companies. After that, we're going to go to a second stage, which we call the recovery stage, and we will be discussing the reopening, the so-called new normal expectations, and how this new situation might affect the investment environment on major projects. So Yoshie, to begin our conversation on what you have noticed in the region, have any countries applied measures for the resumption of economic activities affected or paralyzed due to COVID-19 pandemic?
Yes, Bruno. Due to the COVID-19 outbreak, we are living in a context without precedents that has caused a major impact on the economy and growth of the countries of the region. Most of the economic activities were halted because of the mandatory isolation measures adopted by the governments, allowing only the continuation of activities considered as essential, which are mainly related to health, acquisition of essential goods, transport, among others. For the resumption of economic activities, all the countries in the region have opted for a progressive strategy, subject to compliance with biosecurity conditions imposed and controlled by health authorities. In many countries, the rule is that each sector or economic activity has a specific biosecurity protocol to comply. Other conditions may refer to schedule restrictions, either general or by activities. This happens, for example, in Venezuela, where specific time restrictions were established for each of the authorized economic sectors. At a local or regional level, additional measures have been established to regulate the reactivation of economic activities. For example, in Brazil, these measures may be more rigid and less clear than the provisions of the national government, and may generate the need for discussions with the local government authorities or even judicial measures to keep essential activities in operation. In Colombia, in major cities such as Bogota or Medellin, companies must obtain an economic reactivation permit from the mayor's office before proceeding to resume operations.
Okay, great. So Pepe, in relation to tax compliance and judicial procedures, what is the current situation in the region? How is this new virtual environment affecting such kind of procedures? And also, has there been any changes in the statute of limitation of tax liabilities?
Thank you, Bruno. The pandemic has caused great disruptions, and the tax arena is one of them. I will focus on the leading economies of Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Mexico, Peru, and Venezuela. And effectively, with the notable exception of Mexico and Venezuela, the countries have established extensions for tax compliance and payments to help taxpayers and alleviate the cash flow issues they are facing. In Mexico and Venezuela, curiously, the local authorities, municipal and state authorities have granted extensions to comply with local taxes. And although nowadays tax compliance is usually electronic, nevertheless, taxpayers are facing difficulties imposed by lockdown or quarantine measures that Yoshie was mentioning, as they sometimes have difficult times in accessing the files and data they require to prepare the tax returns, which not always is in an electronic format. So tax authorities are in the region encouraging the use of electronic means to complete tax compliance and to communicate with the tax authorities. And they are assisting the taxpayers virtually and through their web pages. And they have continued audit activity, but using virtual means, and field audits are somehow limited right now. And regarding tax appeals procedures, both before the tax authorities and the tax courts, most countries have suspended them. Initially to June, then they extended it to July, and I think the prospect is that we will face further suspensions in the near future. In Brazil, for example, the procedures have continued using virtual sessions, and in Chile, the procedures have continued, but the discovery phase is suspended during the emergency. And the solutions for the statute of limitations issues is split in the region. You have a group of countries such as Argentina, Chile, Brazil, and Venezuela, in which the statute of limitation continues as under normal circumstances. And other countries, Colombia, Mexico, and Peru, have suspended the statute of limitation of tax liabilities during the pandemic.
Yeah, it's very important to take these kinds of measures in these times of uncertainties and difficulty with complying with procedural requirements and things like that. And so those are very relevant, and we hope that all countries end up taking these kinds of measures. Yoshie, moving on to the financial diagnostics of the major projects in the region. Some jurisdictions have put in place measures to reform insolvency regimes to help manage anticipated increase of companies that are in financial distress situation, some of them on temporary basis and other more permanently. What are the trends in the Latin America countries about insolvency?
Under the COVID-19 context, the reform of the insolvency regime is only being discussed or anticipated in some countries as Brazil, Chile, and Peru. Actually, the trend we see in most of the countries is the issuing of several measures by the governments in order to support distressed businesses with a focus on avoiding the initiation of liquidation and reorganization proceedings. One of the most common measures is the establishment of support programs to face the COVID-19 health emergency at a local, federal, or national level, depending on the country. These programs provide funding to companies to support their operations and employees, or aid employers to pay salaries with a reduction of rates. In most cases, we see that the primary beneficiaries of the programs are medium and small businesses or companies. Also, some dispensations are being granted. For example, in Chile, the majority of rules for the adoption of agreements on liquidation and reorganization proceedings have been more flexible, allowing video conferences or some other forms of recognized electronic voting. In Colombia, there's a short moratorium for payment obligation of reorganization agreements underway. In some jurisdictions, as Brazil, national courts are giving recommendations to authorities on how to deal with some specific matters related to COVID-19 in reorganization lawsuits. As you may see, these measures tend to be temporary to cover the consequences of the COVID-19 outbreak. Maybe in the following months, we will see the adoption of long-term or permanent measures with the knowledge of what we are going through now.
And Pepe, in this line of us helping companies and assisting them with dealing with the situation, what about the trends in relation to tax measures for cash flow issues generated by the pandemic, such as payment extensions, tax exemptions, exonerations, reductions? Are any specific measures for major infrastructure projects in the region?
Yes, Bruno. The countries in the region have showed a trend that they have granted tax exemptions, exonerations, and reductions regarding the pandemic or motivated by the pandemic to alleviate the cash flow issues of taxpayers. But curiously, none of them has addressed specifically major infrastructure projects. They are general measures. And also curiously, that there have been no income tax exemptions, and the income tax is one of the most important sources of revenue for the treasuries. In Mexico, a tax officer informally stated that the income tax exemptions or exonerations for fiscal year 2019, which taxpayers had or have to pay in 2020, was not justified because the pandemic started after the closing of the fiscal year, and perhaps other authorities share that view. And the position may be flawed because the pandemic affects in 2020 the cash flow of taxpayers. We can mention that Argentina and Brazil have reduced their social security contributions. Argentina also reduced the tax on bank debits and credits to 0%. Chile likewise reduced the rate of the stamp tax to 0% in the case of operations for credits to companies and taxpayers in general. And Brazil announced a reduction of the Brazilian tax on financial transactions on credit lines for business, also to 0%. And Brazil, Colombia, Peru, and Venezuela have granted custom duties and VAT exonerations or reductions to 0 rate for the importations of medical equipment and devices and medicines required to combat the pandemic. And Colombia reduced its local taxes, and Mexican local governors are very active and have granted support through local incentives with pardons or reductions in the tax liability of payroll taxes, property tax, and other local taxes, and have implemented measures to support small and medium companies to obtain credit.
And what about tax amnesty programs?
Well, so far only in Brazil you have the Office of the Attorney General of the National Treasury that has issued rules setting for special settlement programs for federal taxes. And the Colombian tax office has issued requirements for taxpayers to apply for special tax payment arrangements, which normally involve financing of the tax debt.
Yoshie, in similar lines to Pepe's explanation, governments have announced various measures to support companies' debt arrangements, including deferred payment, guarantee credit facilities, government-backed loans. How are these measures being developed in Latin America?
Well, we see that in countries as Brazil, Chile, Colombia, and Peru, these measures have been taken by its respective governments. A recurring measure is increasing of financing lines to support companies under a state guaranteeing loans scheme. This is in order to provide working capital to mitigate potential salary reductions during the pandemic, to maintain and promote employment, and to ensure funds for payments and compliance with obligations. We can mention also that in Chile, financing lines with state guarantees have been increased, and banks must reprogram all the pre-existing credits of the benefited debtor and postpone any amortization of their old credits until the new loans are fully paid. In Peru, the government developed the Reactiva Peru program, which aims to promote commercial banks to make available new financings to companies, providing a government guarantee. The loans may be also agreed with public entities, as is the case of Colombia, where the government allowed certain public financial entities that usually act as rediscount banks to grant loans directly. Relief measures for debtors are also considered. For example, the Financial Superintendence of Colombia issued certain instructions to public and private financial entities to grant certain reliefs in case they decide to modify the loans granted. As part of these instructions, such modifications cannot increase the interest rate or apply collection on interest, among other instructions. Other measures aim to support companies which activities are related to the prevention and control of the corona outbreak. For example, we see that in Brazil, the Brazilian Development Bank supported the health industry by making available a credit line for companies that produce or may want to change its production line to build health equipment, including monitors, ventilators, hospital beds, and masks. The loan has a grace period of 24 months and a maturity of 5 years. As we may see, these measures contribute to the liquidity and solvency of the companies, so also have the effect of avoiding the initiation of liquidation and reorganization proceedings, which I commented in my last intervention.
Pepe, regarding deduction of expenses, such as depreciation of fixed assets, charitable donations, forgiveness of debts, bad debt deductions, other expenses, net operating losses, what would be the situation in the region?
Yes, Bruno. With reduced economic activity, companies have less income. So the question of deduction of expenses is very important for tax purposes. We can say that the most relevant expenses taxpayers are facing during the pandemic, besides the regular operating expenses, are the deductions of gifts and donations, mostly charitable donations, bad debt deductions and forgiveness of debts in case of refinancing, accounts receivable, and exchange losses, especially for Latin American companies that are leveraged in foreign currency. And as a final item would be perhaps the possibility of accelerated depreciation of fixed assets. And if it would take a picture of the region, except for Chile, no country has amended the rules to specifically address the deductions of expenses related to the pandemic. Chile issued specific rules allowing the deduction of expenses that companies have to incur to combat the pandemic. For example, the deduction of the home office expenses of its employees, or expenses related to biosecurity measures. So in general, the deduction of charitable donations and gifts, it's in all the countries generally limited to non-for-profit organizations, and which are authorized by the tax authorities, or directly to governmental offices and organizations, and they are subject to caps. And for bad debt deductions and in general for all other expenses, the rule of thumb is that the expense must be normal and necessary or essential for the production of the taxpayer's income. And bad debt deductions and forgiveness of debt are very, very important, and they normally require special evidence and substantiation. For example, taxpayers in the region normally have to provide evidence of the collection efforts and the insolvency situation of the debtor or the guarantors, and legal opinions issued by external counsel. Regarding exchange losses, you have to take care because the rules vary in the region, and you have to consider whether devaluation or accrual of a debt or payment of the debt will trigger the deduction of exchange losses. Unfortunately, there are no specific rules for accelerated depreciation of fixed assets due to the pandemic. Not even Chile has that so far. And I would add to all this bundle of expenses, one item which I think taxpayers will face in the future, and that is the net operating losses generated in 2020. Normally, tax rules in the region provide that the losses generated in a fiscal year can be carried forward to future fiscal years, and the taxpayer can use them to offset taxable income in those future fiscal years. So taxpayers have to be very careful with the rules because they vary in the region, and they normally impose, limits on the number of years a taxpayer can carry forward the losses, or establish caps on the amount of losses that taxpayers can offset.
Thank you both for this very complete and good understanding of what governments are doing and are not doing to assist companies facing this crisis. And now that we do have this comparison between the different countries, and we have good knowledge of where we stand, it's time to consider how companies are going to move past this resilience stage. So let's discuss a bit about what to expect on what would be a recovery phase. Yoshie, we know that governments are taking measures to resume public major projects that were paralyzed or that were affected because of the COVID-19, including those infrastructure projects that were stopped due to general lockdowns. Which countries have applied these kinds of measures?
In various countries, such as Argentina, Brazil, and Chile, the execution of construction activities related to public infrastructure projects continued despite the quarantine or isolation measures taken because of the COVID-19 outbreak. This because the activities were considered essential due to their importance and impact on the economy of the countries. In other countries, as Colombia, the construction activities initially stopped with the isolation measures, but were soon resumed. The continuation of public infrastructure projects demanded the compliance of several requirements, mostly related to the adoption of biosafety protocols for this economic sector, as previously mentioned by Pepe. Likewise, to facilitate its execution, certain countries issued simplification measures, as happened in Chile, where the granting of construction permits was accelerated. Only in a few countries, as is in Venezuela and Peru, construction works have been totally stopped since the beginning of the pandemic, and its resumption has been allowed progressively, always complying with certain biosecurity measures and schedule restrictions. Also, some measures were taken to maintain the economic and financial balance of ongoing contracts. For example, in Peru, we see that the government issued exceptional regulations to promote the resumption of public works. which were stopped during the state of national emergency declared as consequence of the corona outbreak. These regulations recognize the right of the contractors to deadline extensions and payments for the increase of costs for the works and for its execution, applying the new biosafety or sanitary measures, which did not exist when the contracts were subscribed. Also, we can mention that the operation of public infrastructure projects, at least regarding to transportation infrastructure, has not stopped. However, traffic on highways, ports, and airports decreased substantially. And in certain countries, such as Colombia and Peru, tolls payments were suspended. By this time, most projects operate normally, with the exception of airports that remain mostly closed and without national or international air operations, just about for certain activities such as cargo transportation and authorized humanitarian flights.
Pepe, talking now about custom duties in import licenses. Has any country in LATAM established tax and or customs fast track or abbreviated procedures? For example, tax refunds, payment terms?
Oh, yes, Bruno. I think that only Argentina, Brazil, and Colombia have established so far some fast track procedures or relaxed the requirements for the importation of assets. For example, Argentina has established automatic import licenses for disinfectant, cleaning, and hygiene articles and chemical products required for attending the emergency. And Brazil has expedited the customs clearance on the importation of those related products and has established some flexible rules for filing the certificate of origin of those products. And Brazil also has granted the extension for 1 year of drawback regimes that normally provide a suspension of custom duties, and they will end in 2020. They will be extended to the next year. And I think that the other countries will follow that trend because those inputs are required and not always are manufactured in the country. And as an anecdote, Colombia, for example, has prohibited for 6 months the exportation of 24 products that are required to prevent the spread of the virus in Colombia, such as soap and antibacterial gel and special masks. And on the other hand, the Colombian tax office has established abbreviated procedures to request tax refunds and to negotiate payment arrangements of taxes.
This has been very, very interesting on what governments are doing and what's happening in the countries and perspectives for the future. Now for a more subjective question, both of you, do you have any specific advice for companies in terms of what to do now or what would be coming next?
Well, my advice is to expect changes. The context we are in due to the corona outbreak evolves so rapidly that we should expect governments to adjust their regulations and the measures adopted to the date in order to keep facing the reality as it presents, to face the new normal as it is called. Even though the isolation measures have been lifted in most countries, we're still under the effects of the pandemic, and we will be until a vaccine is developed. Governments have made promptly decisions to act against COVID-19 and its foreseeable effects, but we still don't see or can't anticipate all the consequences of the pandemic in the economy of all the countries. So this demands the governments to evaluate and consider the need of new measures or the modification of the existing ones in order to keep supporting companies in distress, but overall to reduce the impacts of the pandemic in its economies. Probably the first option will no longer be to allocate the state funds to make loans to companies, but certain benefits already taken could be extended under this situation, such as the deferral of payments or state guarantees. Governments will have to be inventive to keep avoiding a chain effect of bankruptcy, liquidations, or reorganizations among the companies. So we should be expectant to what's happening in the following months. The reception of foreign capitals would be a way to reactivate the economy, and the reality is that the countries are truly interested in the resumption of major projects and the development of new ones to meet national objectives. For example, it's a primary interest of some countries to improve its infrastructure, starting by health infrastructure, which is really needed under the context we are in.
So what about you, Pepe? What would be your words of wisdom?
I subscribe totally what Yoshie said. This is a moving target, and these circumstances are evolving very fast. Normally, governmental measures lack reality, and they come ahead before after the reality. So companies have to be aware, have to be, having the radar what potential measures the government will take for returning to the normality, and specifically regarding taxes, I have two items. I think that there would be an area of opportunity for companies investing in major infrastructure projects, and I think we're going to. I will try to predict, but countries will probably start to grant tax benefits and incentives for those major projects and to encourage the investment in those projects, and for example, special income tax or VAT exoneration. So I think that companies eager to invest will have to take that into consideration in their strategic planning. And the second point I have is that it has to do with the force majeure exemption that many companies are considering them for contractual purposes, but I think it has also application in the tax arena. And the question is whether taxpayers can use the force majeure exemption argument to be exempt from paying, for example, fines or late payment interest if they pay late their taxes, because the pandemic itself or the governmental measures taken to combat the pandemic have prevented them from paying on time their taxes. So I think that the tax authorities are not very keen with the argument, but it could be used as a tool by taxpayers to defer the payment of taxes, and of course that is only a temporary solution, because once the new normal or the regular normal comes back, they will have still be subject to pay the tax, but at least they will not be penalized by fines or other charges. So in 5 of the countries of the region, taxpayers can use that argument, and I think that this option will likely require litigation, so the final solution perhaps will not be immediate, and will require a lot of activity by the taxpayer, especially the burden of proving its particular circumstances and how the force majeure argument can be used in their case. For example, in Argentina, the argument can be used, but you have low probabilities of success based on court precedents. In Brazil, you, in theory, can use it, but so far it has been unsuccessful in court. And the authorities have used, and the courts have decided that really the executive and the legislative powers have issued measures to alleviate the adverse consequences of the pandemic, so that they should be enough to alleviate the situation of the taxpayers. In Chile, the issue has not been raised. And in Peru, the argument cannot be used, but the authority, the tax authority in Peru, will not impose tax penalties. It is a discretionary measure for infractions related to tax formal duties during the pandemic. And in Colombia and Mexico and Venezuela, the argument can be used, but the burden of proof is totally in the head of the taxpayer. So one recommendation, practical recommendation, is for taxpayers is to contemporaneously substantiate the particular circumstances that have prevented them from paying their taxes on time. So in the future, when a tax audit comes and a tax authority pretends to issue a deficiency assessment based on the late payment of the taxes, the taxpayer will have the required evidence to argue the force majeure exemption and get free out of the fines or potential late payment interest.
This has been a very, very interesting conversation. I would like to thank you a lot, Pepe and Yoshie, for enlightening us with these measures and these new events in Latin America. It got me thinking that if governments in the region would talk more amongst themselves, we would probably have better situations and countries best well equipped, since there are good examples in different areas in each of the countries.
Thank you so much, Bruno. Thank you so much, Pepe. I'm really glad we had this conversation, and maybe we can further explain the modifications or adjustments to the measures we have talked about in a following podcast.
Thank you, Yoshie and Bruno. It was a pleasure and an honor. And for the audience, please stay tuned for the coming podcasts in other areas that you will soon receive.
Great. So this ends our episode of the podcast on financial relief measures in Latin America's major projects. We'd like to thank you again for joining us. On behalf of Latin America Energy, Mining and Infrastructure team, I'd like to say that we are happy to provide further insight and answer any questions you may have.